Film is separated from almost any other art form by its ability to really convey motion, to show how the characters move through the scene and move the viewer through it with them. And one of the biggest ways we convey motion on screen is by moving the camera. Camera movement can help to immerse the viewer in the story, but it can also really take them out of it when it's done poorly. So in today's video, I want to share with you how you can use it and how you can use it well. Starting out with the different types of camera moves you can use in your shots. First, you have these lateral camera motions where the camera can push or pull either forward or backwards, or track either left or right. If you're working on a larger, more involved production, this type of camera move would traditionally be done with like a slider or a dolly. But for the more run and gun style of filmmaking that we tend to talk about in these videos, you're probably going to be doing most of this on like a gimbal or handheld. It's more about the concept and the idea of how the camera moves through the scene than it is about the gear that you use to move it. That being said, this next type of camera move is one that's literally named after like the heavy, expensive, difficult to use gear that you would traditionally use to achieve it, and that is a jib, where the camera moves up or down, and you don't need an actual jib to do this. You can totally do this with a gimbal, a drone, or just completely handheld. Once again, it's about the theory mostly. Moving on from those, the camera can also pan left to right or tilt up and down. And in these cases, the camera's not actually moving through the scene, it's just rotating around to change the field of view. And finally, we have just camera shake, like handheld camera motion, which can add some grit or intensity to the scene and can also very easily be overdone. So you gotta be careful with this one when you use it in your films. And most camera moves are going to be a combination of like two or more of those movements we just talked about. So you might have a camera movement where the camera is tracking left to right, but also panning right to left. And then you have an orbit where the camera is kind of circling around the subject and keeping it in the frame. And other examples like that, you know, maybe you're jibbing the camera up, but tilting down to keep the subject in frame, and there's some handheld movement in there as well. The possibilities are pretty much endless once you start combining these together. And of course, we do also need to mention static shots, like a just locked off shot on a tripod like this one is not like leaving something out. You don't need camera motion. A static, completely locked off shot with no movement of the camera can also be perfectly fine when used intentionally and can serve the story. So now that we've gone over the different ways to move your camera, let's talk about why. Like, what are the different reasons that you should have to move the camera through the scene? Why might you want to? Perhaps the most simple is just to follow a subject, to keep the subject in the frame. For example, having the camera track next to a subject as they're walking through the scene. Beyond just following a subject, you could also use some camera motion to place emphasis on a subject, like a slow push in to highlight the importance of that person in the scene. Camera motion can also create a feeling for the viewer. So having the camera very quickly orbit around a subject can indicate confusion or that they're very overwhelmed by their surroundings, and having some handheld camera shake in the shot can add some extra tension and grit to the scene. In addition to conveying a subject a certain way, you can also move the camera to shift the focus from one subject to another. So for example, maybe starting on a shot of a person and slowly pulling out to reveal the vast landscape around them. So we've gone through the different ways to move the camera, the different reasons to move the camera, and now let's talk about some ways to move the camera well, just some tips to help you achieve better camera motion in your footage. Perhaps the biggest, most important is to motivate your camera motion. There should be a reason that the camera is moving. This could mean tracking to follow a character through the scene, or panning over to show what they're looking at. So in either of those examples, the motion of the character in front of the camera is motivating the motion of the camera itself. One technique I use all the time is to use foreground to emphasize your camera motion. So have something really close to the lens. That way, when the camera does move, it moves more dramatically. You can see that motion more clearly. And this is particularly helpful when you're shooting either handheld or with a smaller rig like a short slider, where you don't have too much range of motion. And finally, a very simple one that I guess kind of goes without saying, but is still important to mention, is just to make sure it's smooth, because a jittery, rocky camera motion can just be incredibly distracting for your shot. And of course, handheld camera shake is not inherently bad, but it needs to be used intentionally and not just be a distraction from the motion of the camera. It needs to seamlessly fit into the scene. If you are shooting handheld, there are plenty of techniques you can use to smooth out your camera motion, one of the simplest being just shooting at 30 frames a second and then slowing the footage down to 80% speed in post. But our next video is going to be solely focused on getting good handheld camera motion, so stick around for that and we will dive way more in detail on that particular little subcategory of this topic. I hope you've enjoyed this video, learned some new useful techniques from it. If you did, make sure to subscribe to Adorama TV for more videos just like this one. If you're feeling a little crazy, you can also subscribe to me. Just gonna throw that out there. But all that being said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.